Welcome to another episode of React tutorial series. In this video, we're going to learn about React.memo. We're going to learn two things. One is useMemo hook. This is a hook, and another one is React.memo. So I have this simple component. This is just returning a text, my component. Now suppose I want to do some complex calculation. Like for example, I have one constant calculated value and I'm doing some complex calculation like 5 multiplied by 4. Now definitely I'm not doing any complex calculation, but assume this is a complex one and we don't want to do this calculation every time we render the component. And definitely I have to show this calculated value. Now I'm showing 25 multiplied by 4. Now you can see that every time I render this component, I'm going to calculate the value, and I don't want that. I want to memorize that value somewhere. So for that we can use the useMemo. But before that, let's simulate the re-rendering of this component. So for that I can use one state and set state equals to use state. Initial value can be 0 and I'm going to increment it whenever I click this button re-render, and on click of this button I'm going to set state. So I have nothing but one button called re-render. On click of this button I'm changing the state, so the component will re-render. So it is just a hack for re-rendering, for testing the re-rendering. Now see, if I click on this, it is re-rendering, but you don't see any changes, right? So for that I'm going to add some logging, console log rendering component. Now see, whenever we are logging this rendering component, we are calculating the value. So if I click on re-render, you can see that I am printing this rendering component. I'm logging this. That means we're calculating this value 5 multiplied by 4. Now if you don't want to calculate this multiple times, you can use useMemo. I'll show you how it works. First, import useMemo from React. So this is a hook, so I'm going to call it over here useMemo. The first parameter will be one function. This function will be called once and it will return some value, and the return value we're going to store in calculated value. This constant we're going to store it, and I'm going to return our calculation, that is 5 multiplied by 4. All right, I'm going to remove this. Now the second parameter is the dependency. This dependency means this is one array. In this dependencies array, you can provide the dependencies. Suppose your calculated value is dependent on some other value, and if that value changes, you want to recalculate it. So for that reason, we can use this dependencies array. But it's a spelling mistake, this calculated value. Now I can add one more logging over here, console log. I can say that I am calculating value. Now see what happens. I'm going to refresh the page. First we're calculating the value and then rendering the component, right? First calculating value and then rendering component. Now see what happens when I click on re-render. If I click on re-render, I'm only rendering the component, but I'm not calculating the value. So that is important here. So if you want to cache the value and you don't want to do the complex calculation, you can use this useMemo hook. Alright, coming to the second part, that is React.memo. Suppose you are not caching just one value, you want to cache the entire component. So for that reason, you can use React.memo. I'll show you the example. So I don't need this calculated value now. I'm going to remove this now, and I will keep the re-rendering part. Now suppose I'm having one more component called child component. All right, now I have one parent component, that is page, and another child component. Now let's add some logging. For child component, I'm going to add rendering child, and for parent component, I'm going to add rendering parent. Now if I refresh the page, first I'm rendering parent and then rendering child. Now if I add two child component, you can see that I'm rendering child component twice. All right, now look at this. If I re-render this component, if I re-render the parent component, let's call it a re-render parent. So if I click on this re-render parent, you can see I'm rendering the parent and also I'm rendering the child. Now suppose this child component is not very simple. This is a complex child component and I don't want to re-render it multiple times. This child component is not taking any props. We don't have to re-render it multiple times, right? Because if the props are not changing, then we can assume that the component will be same. So why re-render it multiple times? So for that, we can use React.memo. Implementation is very simple. You just have to import memo from React and you wrap your component with this memo. Now again, as it is TypeScript, if you wrap your component with any function, then ESLint will not be able to understand the component name. So normally the function name is the component name, but ESLint will not be able to understand it. So I'm going to add the display name child component dot display name equals to child component. This is required for TypeScript and ESLint. Now look at this. If I click on re-render parent, I'm only rendering the parent and not the child. Now this is one simple component, but your actual component will be very complex. And that's why it is always a good practice to wrap your component with memo. If you know that your component is stable and you don't have to re-render it multiple times. Now what happens when you pass some props in your component? What happens? So suppose in this component, child component, you are passing something like some parameters like state equals to some value like some numbers 3. We'll remove the second component here. Now here in this component, I'm going to get the props over here, and I can also render the state. All right, as it is TypeScript, let's add some type for now. Now you can see child component is 3, child component state is 3. If I re-render the parent, it is not going to render the child. The reason is the state is same. Now suppose I want to change it. Suppose I change the state every time I re-render. What happens then? Here we have this changing state. So what happens when we pass this state? Now if you see, if I click on re-render parent, it is rendering parent and child both. The reason is whenever I'm changing the props, the output of the component will be different. That's why we cannot use the cast value, and that's why whenever you are changing a different state or different props, then the cache will be invalidated. React will throw away the stored component and it will calculate the component again. It will call the child component again. So this is really important to understand whenever you are using memo. Just because you're using memo doesn't mean that your component will not be rendered anytime in the future. So always look at the props, that you should not change the props if you want to stop the rendering. So that's it for today's video. If you liked it, please hit like, and if you have any questions or any comments, please let me know in the comment section and I'll try to answer them. And if you're liking the series, you can consider subscribing so that you can get notified about my other videos. Thank you so much for watching. We'll see you in the next episode.